Hello, this is Jason Dean at Film Fanatic, and back at it again. So we got another video coming your way. This is another interview segment. This has been great. I really love that people have been chiming in and checking out the videos, and it's been really helpful with the overall page and pages. I have a Facebook page, Main Film Fanatic, that's been in existence for about 5 or 6 years now, and this YouTube channel is pretty new. The channel itself has been up for a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years, but just recently, this past year, I started using it more often. I used to do a lot of Facebook live videos. That's where it started off as far as trying to tackle the video format, and I moved it over to what you see here as the YouTube channel. It's a little bit easier right now with my schedule, and the technical setup is a lot easier. So I really want to thank everybody for checking out the videos and helping this whole thing grow. And one of the things I've been wanting to do, which I really, really enjoy, is trying to have guests on the show. So that's been really helpful for the channel. I've done it about 3 or 4 times, and I did a show recently with my great friend Emmett Layler, who I play in a band called Split Willow with, and he has a real deep love and appreciation for all things horror, and we did a show mainly on Stephen King, which is like his specialty, but then we also did a lot of stuff around that also. So thanks again. So this show here started off as an idea that I guess wasn't taken totally seriously by me. Or I was at dinner with my parents. This is my mom here, Susan Dean, and we were at dinner. My mom and dad and my good friends Daniel Richmond and Julian Reed, and we were talking about the page because Daniel has been really helpful with giving me ideas and helping me develop this whole crazy thing. And it came up as an idea. Why don't you like have your mom come up, and be a guest on the show, And I was like, we all kind of laughed and chuckled for a few minutes, and then later that night I actually thought about it, and I was like, you know what? On paper, yeah, it's kind of silly and a little bit goofy. But then I thought, well, on paper, it totally makes sense because she gave birth to me, and and then also got me into movies growing up. So starting off with like Alfred Hitchcock and all other things related to horror, like Friday 13th, the Friday 13th franchise, which I just did a big show on. She's really also into like the Final Destination series. Uh, and so all those movies were part of my crazy, weird development of has made me into the film fanatic that I am. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, this is my mom, Susan Dean.
Hi.
So yeah, I thought if you wanted to like talk about like I said, and I've talked about this idea for the show for in a couple other shows where I raised the idea or issue of like maybe doing a thing of where we could talk a little bit about some of the first you know times that I was exposed to Alfred Hitchcock and all things horror, seeing Jason Voorhees on the big screen for the first time for Friday
That's your
13th.
namesake.
So, yeah.
Well, I didn't know what started it because I was pregnant with you, and I went to see Jaws, so that might have started it because I was told it's a horrible movie and you shouldn't go see that. So there I was. So that might have been your inception to
Really?
horror.
So, you were pregnant and you saw Jaws, and that's
Yeah,
what. Wow.
sitting right. Yeah, I was like 8 months pregnant, and there we go. I thought it was great. And then after that, when you were born, then it was always like Godzilla and
Right?
all that stuff. Even though I was supposed to put you on to Sesame Street, which you didn't like, you got very bored with that. So in a way, I figured, well, Godzilla would be educational because you could count the trains he stepped on, the people that were in the trains, but it was black and white, so we couldn't do the color part of that.
Right, right.
But yeah, so then we graduated, and you saw the birds, which you were only like maybe five or
Yep.
six.
Yeah, I remember all that stuff like it was yesterday. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and from there, I mean, you just went on. You saw the, what is it? I call it the Pod People, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
Right,
the
right.
first one, and you find humor in all of these movies. It's
Absolutely.
like the guy that was running in the streets telling everybody about the pods.
Right.
Nobody believed him, and you find humor in that because
Absolutely.
that would be you. You would be batting your head
Right.
against the wall. Nobody listened
It's
to you.
kind
Life.
of realistic that way.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and all those kind of movies. Then you went to Duel. That was
Yep.
suspenseful. You never knew who was in the truck. And a lot of the Alfred Hitchcock movies, like I don't know them. Remember them?
Yep.
The Ants. That I don't think that was Alfred Hitchcock. That was just a B
That
movie.
was one of the early like B movies, I think, from like the 1950s.
Yeah.
Yep.
What is it? Arnest. Dave, what's his name?
Was it Richard Arness
Gunsmoke guy.
or David Arness? Maybe it was David
Yeah.
Arness, but yeah, yeah, yeah.
He was in that. But all those kind of dumb movies, which I guess I thought they were age appropriate, but that's what
Um,
I liked. So that's what you ended up watching.
Tourist Trap.
Oh, that's my favorite.
I did a show actually on that movie pretty recently, and I remember that was a TV that was originally a movie that came out and it couldn't get an R rating. Originally, like the filmmakers wanted to get it to give it to get the R rating so it could get theatrical release, but it wasn't able to get that, so it got a PG rating, and then so
Oh,
it
wow.
ended up getting in syndication. So I remember that was a movie I grew up watching, and as you know, and it's amazing how demented and crazy that movie is. I saw an interview with the director, and he was talking about he was flabbergasted when they struck that deal with Tourist Trap, but then he was also like, obviously they started making money off of the movie, but he was like, wow, this movie went on to like, give little kids across the United States, give them nightmares, and I was one of them. So,
Mm.
um, what was it like? I didn't realize that you saw Jaws in the theater, and I
Yeah,
was pregnant.
yeah.
What was that like seeing that movie on the experience of seeing that when it first came out in the theater?
Well, like I said, everybody said like warned against it. It's so horrible. The girls swimming naked in the beginning and the whole bit. But I mean, it's to me, I found it interesting to be drunk and stupid and go swimming in the dark, and there comes a big fish. It's gonna
Right,
make
right.
you into chum, and that's how I looked at it. That's how I kind of look at everything on the lighter side.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but it was a movie that, I mean, it really swept every theater. Everybody wanted to see
It
it,
was a
but then didn't
phenomenon,
want to
yeah.
see it. But yeah, but I think that's when you might have first got the bug, because when you're pregnant, you're supposed to teach the fetus, the opera and all that stuff. So I taught you Jaws.
Well, I remember too, like even when I started, seeing like movies like Friday the 13th, and I remember
Oh,
we used to go to the movies,
We used to laugh over those.
but even though like for me they were scary, and at times I would get nightmares from a lot of those movies, but you always kind of instilled in me of like separating, well, this is like, it's fantasy, it's like, this is
One's
fun,
fake,
and
yeah.
it's not meant to be taken that seriously. So I always had, even at a young age, and I definitely have that now, I tend to like movies now that are even more over the top in that regard, as far
Mm.
as like the comedic thing or the silliness. But I remember you kind of always,
Well,
instilling it on me not to take it so seriously, and it always like broke the levity
well,
of
yeah.
the heavier,
If
horrific part
if
of those
you
films.
if you look at Jason, he's the two people are making love on a bed, and he comes in with a knife and goes through both of them in the bed.
Right.
I mean, where is reality
Right.
in that?
Right.
That's not going to
Absolutely.
happen.
Absolutely.
It actually becomes comical
Mm-hmm.
because it can happen.
Right.
And like Halloween, like you got Donald Pleasance, he went through more than Michael Myers did. He was like the comedy relief of that whole movie.
Absolutely.
And he's
Especially 5 movies in.
everything happened to him that happened to Michael
Right.
Myers. They were both still alive. It was, it's amazing. But I like the car. That was a good movie when you were young.
Yeah, that was
That was
another. That's one of
suspenseful.
my all-time favorite classic kind of B grindhouse movies. I did a show on that, and I remember talking to you when I bought that on Blu-ray because I talk about it a lot on the show. That my favorite place to go shopping is Bull Moose Music. It's kind of my home away from home, and it was a couple of years ago. I was there, and I saw that they had the car with James Brolin,
Yeah, he was in that.
and the car is basically, well, like you brought up Jaws, like the car is basically a ripoff of
Yeah,
Jaws,
yeah.
and it's one of the greatest like exploitation horror movies. And but like I said, I remember seeing that all the time on TV, and it scared me. But it was also like it was like the first time where, well, like I was talking about it when I did the show with Emmett, like first getting that feeling of where I was scared, but then it turned into a thing of where I wanted that feeling again. It was like being on a roller coaster. But yet, at the same time, I knew it was make believe, even at the young age. And at a young age, I remember seeing the car because that was always on cable. That was one of those movies, and I remember always getting that, and that's when I got that feeling. And I remember when I saw it at Blue Moose 2 or 3 years ago, and I bought it on Blu-ray, which I was just like, oh my god, I can't believe,
They
because the
made
movie
it.
is in a lot of ways it's kind of a piece of crap, but it's amazing. And I remember calling you or telling you that, oh, like I
I
got the
got it.
car on Blu-ray. Like, do you remember that? And it was just like I just had this like overwhelming feeling of like nostalgia, and it was like, it's such a part of my childhood. And watching it now, I love it even more on Blu-ray.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's wild. And it was, I don't know how many freaking years ago that was.
Now you also you got that. You told me you got the frogs,
The frogs. Yep, I
the
got that
Ravenland.
recently too.
The people got gummed to death.
Yep. Yeah.
Now
Just
that I saw in the movie theater too when that came out
wow.
in Haverstraw. That was a big.
Was it in like the? Was it in the
Right in
drive-in?
no, right in town, where school was in Haverstraw.
Okay.
There was a big movie theater there, and they used to put on bands every week, similar to I guess downtown in Belfast, similar to that kind of theater. They had a
Hmm.
big stage. It was very old.
This was all in New York,
Yeah,
Rockland County.
and
Yeah.
that's when I saw frogs, and I just found that hysterical because all these little frogs are coming and eating people. It just didn't make any sense to me at all. But it was entertaining.
Um.
But
Yeah,
then,
and it's a movie I've seen,
yeah, it
fairly
might,
recently, and I'm almost in love with those kinds of things more
yeah,
now
it
than
might scare a little kid.
I was. And one of the things too, like I brought up in another video about, doing this show, and it started off as like kind of this, silly, goofy, crazy idea, but then I was like, oh, this totally makes sense, but because I mean, you set me on this path, and
Poor kid.
and but then I was also thinking like, things are very different now with how parents kind of interact with their kids, and then also how what kids are exposed to now. And I was thinking too, like, probably like the stuff that you did let me see in that movies that you would take me to go see in the theater, and then like when it was also during the time of VHS, and then everything was on cable. A lot of kids now would, their parents would never,
Oh
ever in a
no.
million years let them watch, some of the Halloween movies or Jaws, or even I remember one of my earliest recollection or memory of going to the movies and being utterly terrified was I remember you had taken me to see Aliens. I don't know if you
Oh
remember
yeah.
this. The second Alien movie after Ridley Scott's movie, which is an amazing, I think, masterpiece. And I remember we went. It was me, you, and Dad. We went to the movies, the three of us. And I remember, like, that movie is super intense and super dark. And I remember that movie gave me nightmares for like weeks. But yet, even even at that time, I was like,
It's fake.
I want
It's
to have
fake.
this. I want to have this experience again. And I knew it was fake
Yeah.
because, but at the same time, it struck a chord with me where it just really scared me. And but yet I was addicted to it. And I remember you had taken me to the theater to see that, and I don't think too many parents now would probably do that,
No,
and
no. But
so
then the kids today play video games that are worse than the movies were.
right.
So it's six of one, half a dozen of the other. And if you know it's fake, and you can talk about the movie, I mean, like A Night of the Living Dead that was shot, and that was scary. To me, that was scary. It was so cheaply done,
Yep,
but
absolutely.
it was
Pretty
so
realistic too.
That's it. It
That's the
was
thing that
real,
makes it scary. Is it?
and that made it so scary.
I remember too. I've talked about this before in other shows. I did a show on one of my all time favorite movies, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the
No, I
original.
don't like that one.
And
But you got his picture there.
yep, good old Leatherface. Uh, and and then another movie is the which I'll eventually do a show on, is the original, the Exorcist, because there's going to be a remake coming out shortly, which I don't know, might be okay. I don't know. David Allen Green, who was responsible for the last three Halloween movies, he's actually is directing a remake of the Exorcist. So sometimes his stuff is pretty good. But anyway, I remember growing up like watching obviously all these movies like Friday the 13th and all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies and a bunch of slasher movies and, like I said, The Car, Jaws. But I remember the only two movies you wouldn't let me watch. You used to let me pretty much watch anything, and we go to the theater, the same thing. But the only two movies you wouldn't let me watch was Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Exorcist. And I remember you always telling me that for you or your own taste, you felt that they were too real and too scary in a
Well,
way, and so like you felt like that those movies would just generally bother me or give me nightmares. So I never saw them. I didn't see those movies till much later, till like I think
teens, I guess, right? Maybe
probably in
later.
college when I was in my
Yeah.
20s. I
Now,
didn't. So I don't know if you want to talk about that at
the
all. About
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like didn't that actually some similar type of thing happen?
yeah, well,
Actually,
it's
so it was to me
right.
that's too real.
It's loosely based on Ed Gein, who was a notorious serial killer.
Yeah,
Who
so that kind of stuff, that it's not fun. It's not fun to watch. You
right,
can't separate the real from the fake. It doesn't sit right with me. And
right,
maybe I felt that you would have nightmares, but I didn't know you had nightmares before from the other stuff.
right.
So, but
Explains
yeah,
a lot.
but I don't like anything with little kids in it or dolls. They just drive me crazy, and I have no idea why, but that stuff just bothers me.
Um, no, it totally makes sense, and
Like,
I didn't see those two films.
you saw Children of the Corn, right?
Children of the Corn. Yep.
Yeah, that was another freaky movie. That one I didn't mind watching though. And the fog was good.
John
That you
Carpenter.
were
Yep.
small when the
Yep.
fog came out. And all of your Halloween, and we used to watch too. Remember Tales from the Crypt?
Yep. We used to
That
watch
was good.
that weekly, every week.
Yeah.
And
And
then
your uncle came over that one week with his suitcase. He was going to spend the weekend. And you and I had Tales from the Crypt on. And he left.
Really?
He didn't want to stay. He couldn't take that kind of
is it
entertainment.
Uncle
Charlie.
Uncle Charlie?
He couldn't take that
He
kind
ended
of
up leaving.
entertainment. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I don't remember that.
So well.
Yeah, we used to watch Tales from the Crypt, and I remember eventually there was another show on after that, Tales from the Dark Side, which was kind of kind of similar in some ways. It was a regular like weekly horror show.
Creature features.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was yeah, that was great. I remember the other thing that I was totally obsessed with was the Incredible Hulk, the TV
Oh,
show
the Hulk. Oh,
with Lou
God.
Ferrigno.
You became David.
That was
Grandma picked you up from nursery school, and you went to Dunkin' Donuts. And you and her were sitting at the counter. I think Aunt Edna was with her. And she didn't know why a man came over to you. He was a reporter from the Journal News.
I
He
think I
thought she
remember
was
this.
so
Yeah.
cute. He wanted to do a little picture and article because she was such a cute little kid. And you just sat at the counter, and he asked you your name, and you said, David.
Huh.
And he said, what's your name? David. Don't get me mad. Because when you got mad,
You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
Yeah, something like that.
Yep.
And Grandma came. I don't know what's wrong with him. He said his name is David. You were actually him at
Wow.
that point in time. You took on that character.
Yeah, that was
It's
I
strange.
do remember that, and I remember that was like probably like the first TV show, and it was probably because I got way into comic books also during that time, and used to take me
Oh,
to
Stout
Stout
Steve's.
Steve's, and I used to get comic books all the
Every
time.
week, every week. That was your reading for the
That
week.
was how easy.
Comic
That was
books.
also how I kind of got into music because that was one of those old school comic book shops. But then they had, remember, we would go in and they have all the old vintage like Kiss posters.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, they had posters
they were
all
kind of
over.
new back then, but they had all the pictures of the original Kiss lineup: Gene Simmons and Peter Criss and Ace Frehley, Paul Stanley, and they had them all these posters of them in their full makeup. And I remember going in and just being like, it felt like going into this magical place. And because I was really into comic books, I felt like while seeing these posters, and these were actual like flesh and blood people and performers, and they were playing rock music. But I felt like these guys were like live, like real life comic book characters come to life, and it was just. And I remember, yeah, we used to go there every week, like every Thursday or
Oh,
Friday.
yeah, you used to get a comic book
Yep.
every week. And because everybody knows you shouldn't read comic books, they're no good for you. But I just figured reading is reading. And now you're an avid reader. And it's because you read the comic books that held your interest and you read comic books.
Yeah,
There's nothing wrong with that.
and it's so funny too that you say that because that at that time, comic books were like just for like a really young audience, and they weren't taken seriously. And now, the last 10 years, it's the biggest like
Oh,
industry in
yeah,
the entire
Marvel.
universe.
Right, Marvel making all the
So
movies.
between DC Comics and Marvel Comics, I mean it's everywhere. And I remember even as a kid when I got into like Daredevil, X Men, and all those things, like uh, after a couple of years, thinking like, wow, like these would make really great movies, because that was also during the same
Yeah.
time I was seeing all these horror movies. Um, and you like in the beginning of the show, when we started, you brought up, I brought it up a couple times, Alfred Hitchcock, and I think I might have even seen The Birds before I saw Psycho.
Oh, Psycho, right. Yeah, I forgot
But I
about that.
remember that like really vividly about that. A lot of his movies were on cable all the time, and I don't know if you rented them or whatnot, but
You know, they're black and white.
and
They
they were
were
black and
all,
white,
yeah.
and we used to see those. And you were always into his stuff, and you knew a lot about a lot of his films, and but I remember that being a real big kind of like staple of my diet as a kid, as far as stuff I was watching.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was. But I remember The Birds. I remember that being the
Well,
movie.
yeah, I mean, it was scary, but, it was, hopefully it doesn't happen, but it was a scary movie, intense. And yeah, we saw that. That was black and white.
And also kind of realistic in its own way too.
Yeah.
Um, do you like? So I mean, and I know you like even now. You guys. I mean, I know you guys both watch. You and Dad both watch a lot of movies still, and you have a pretty big movie collection in your own right. Um, and I know lately been doing lots of like television shows, but even after all these years, like you still consider yourself a fan of horror movies
Oh yeah, yeah.
and all
I
that
like
stuff.
like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I think you got me the second one,
Right.
and they were good because some of the second ones that they do, they just ruin them. They take away. They should
The
leave
remakes.
it.
Yep.
Yeah, at one. But that all brought you too into to your heavy metal. You went into the music. Were doing what is it, death metal?
Yeah,
That
that was
brought you
all.
into
That all
that.
led
You
into
got to
that.
into
Absolutely.
Sectorian. You made your own band.
Yep.
You'd be downstairs in the basement, and me and Dad would be upstairs eating, and literally watch the forks and knives bounce off the table.
Yep. Yep.
But that was,
Well, again, too, like I've said too, with the crazy things that I love to do and slightly weird things that I'm into as far as like the movies and a lot of the movies I cover and then like the original stuff, music wise, that I do with like my band Quantum and stuff. Like, and I've talked a lot about that band, and that's where my love or passion for film, I kind of dump all that kind of stuff into that band. And but I couldn't do a lot of these things that were not necessarily like something, not things that are necessarily like commercial, but I couldn't do none of these things without the support of like wonderful people like this. Um and but it was always a thing of where so I've always feel like really fortunate, because I know a lot of people don't have that kind of thing. So I never tried to take that for granted. And with and then doing these kinds of things that I do, which are kind of relatively on the fringe side of things. They're not. But I think I've worked with kids for a long time. Through working with the teen center, and I now work at the Montessori uh, school, which has been an amazing job. And just seeing how it's letting kids be kids is such an integral part of growing up. Like you said too, like bringing up the when I eventually like I got exposed to like these movies, and then I got into comic books, and then that grew from there. From comic books, I got into music. Kiss was that band, that gateway
Yeah.
band. It's a band I still love, because it was like a kind of a continuation of like, or a culmination of like the comic love of comic books, but then horror and science fiction. And then suddenly, like, I see these guys that are playing real life, characters, and then that's when I kind of got into music. And then, you guys, like you said about the scenario of like sitting at the dinner table and the furniture rattling, and that's the other thing. A lot of parents
Oh,
would
they.
not tolerate that at all, and
Well,
like,
that would be the biggest thing that I would get from other parents is, how can you stand that?
yeah, I
So
know,
much noise.
like a lot of parents now that they and and kids that I've worked with over the years that I teach, um, or that I've taught, like having drums per just like using as an example, it could be any instrument, but mainly
Drums.
drums, because they're loud, they can be really loud. So and I know the parents, I've had that conversation with parents before, and also kids, where Christmas time comes, or their birthdays, and the parents are like wanting to get them something, but then there's all this like reservation about like buying the kids drum set. Like, they want the kid to play music or do something, so they're like thinking about all these alternatives. Like, maybe we'll just get a practice pad, or maybe we'll get these nice electronic drums that we can just plug. The kid can just, my
Yeah,
son or
that's not
daughter
right.
can like plug in their headphones, so we can't listen to the volume of the drums and things shaking or whatnot.
No, you got to be you.
And so, again, I think that goes back to like, it's a different time. It's a different. I grew up in a different time, and
Well,
so I
they,
feel fortunate that you did put up with all that crap, and even the crap now. But
I,
you
I
know,
had a different tolerance.
right,
The teacher from school called me several times because you were driving them crazy in class, tapping on everything with pencils. And after I heard that for about a month that they complaining, you got to do something, you got to do something, I said, I guess he wants to be a drummer. And
really.
I bought you a set of drums.
Well,
And
I don't
that,
remember. So
yeah,
I
and that you
actually had
became,
teachers call
they
and say that
complained
because I was
about you
banging on things
banging on
constantly.
stuff.
Huh.
It's all like that, tap, tap, tap. So
Wow.
that
And
told
that's what
me,
started when you got my first drum set, which I
yeah,
think I was
you
maybe
were lit. Geez, you were like,
14.
no, you were like 3 years old. I bought you that
The
little
little
toy
little
kit.
toy kit.
I
Yeah,
have a
yeah.
picture of that someplace.
Um,
But that's what it told me. Not to say don't do that ever again. You're trying to tell me something. So by tapping, it means drums, sticks. So that's how my mind went. Instead of saying you can't do that in school, that's not right. This way now you got your frustration out. You knew you had drums at home, so you stopped tapping in school.
right,
It's
right.
simple.
Yeah, it's very different.
Common sense is what it is.
I think it's a very different thing, because I think one of the alternatives ends up happening. It could be wrong, but it's just like something that I think about, and what I've come across a lot is, nowadays. Well, like when I was a kid, I remember as being a kid. when school would get out and we have summer vacation, I would just basically hang out with my friends or walk around with my Walkman, and then I was, I think I was playing music a little bit with some buddies, and we just basically hang out. But we had the whole like summer free, and we would just kind of hang out. And then, the I remember when school was approaching the last couple of weeks, like getting really depressed, like, oh my God, I go back to school and go back to this prison. But it was like, I remember at that time, you know, like those were great times because I felt like summertime was really summer, and you could just, you know, completely decompress from
Yeah.
the BS of being in school, and just do what you want to do and sleep late, watch cartoons, and stay up late, eat pizza, whatever, and it was great. And one thing I noticed too with how things are now that are different, which I think in some ways it's good, but one thing I notice now is that a lot of kids, like I noticed it when I worked at the teen center, is that like nowadays kids are like their schedules once they get out of school are like completely freaking jam packed with like
It's overload.
soccer camp, basketball camp, some kind of three or four different kinds of summer camp, and then they have to go on these like trips with like maybe if they are part of some other school group or sporting group, they have to go on trips, or they gotta like they're so super busy there, and even during the summertime where like they're packed, they're actually maxed out, and I'm always amazed. And even during the school year with kids where they have they have so many things going on, all kinds of practices, for different things that they're belonging to or whatnot. But especially, I remember being taken back by a lot of the kids that I was working with at the teen center, where they, and they're like, yeah, I'm like, I have 2 weeks or a week after I get out of school, I'm just gonna be home, and then after that, I got to go with this camp and then this camp, and I'm just like, I would always remember asking him or thinking like, when can they just like
Be them.
be them and be a kid? And that's kind of what summer was back then. I thought like being
Free.
free,
Yeah.
but it's very different. I noticed that's very different, and I didn't even know. That's all I knew growing up.
Mm.
You know.
Well, today though, there's too much. You're spreading everything too thin. If your kid likes basketball, your kid likes baseball, go in that. Let him make the decisions. Don't put him in a basketball, baseball, multitudes of things. Let him decide which way he goes. If he's not that good in it, he'll stop on his own or he'll continue and try to get better. But give him the chance, the opportunity, the breathing space to do all these different facets. It's not good because the kid's getting confused. What do I do better? Gee, I have to do this because my mother likes this. I have to do this. My father likes this. Let him be himself. I mean, I got in school.
Absolutely.
You used to wear shirts. I used to buy you this grotesque monster T-shirt.
Yeah, I eventually got into heavy metal and death metal, and
well, they
yep.
would call me up at school.
Yep.
Jason dresses terrible, and he shouldn't wear those shirts. I said he's happy with them. Leave him alone. That's all that matters. It was in the dress code.
And
Fine.
it was the same thing as continuation. It was the same kind of thing of loving horror movies. It was just pure fiction and escapism,
Yeah.
but it was make believe. And
But it was you.
yeah. But it was
I wanted
me.
you to be an independent thinker. You don't have to go with the flock, and everything be togetherness.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody's different. So you have to find your own little niche. And you found it. And you're doing what you love to do. That's life. That's what it should be all about.
Yep,
Not
absolutely.
trying to beat this guy and beat that guy and have this constant competition. And I got to make my parents proud doing this. Your parents are going to be proud if you're just doing what you want to do. And you're happy.
Right.
That makes your parents proud.
Yep, absolutely.
I mean, that's the way I always thought. I didn't want to say like, all right, you like drums. Now I'm going to go get you an exclusive school. I'm going to force you to take drums. You're going to end up hating drums. Do it on your own. You learn slowly and gradually at your pace,
Right.
and you love it. You don't resent it. where you can't could resent it if it's an overload.
Yeah, no, I think that totally nails it because I think I think when parents are seeing their kids maybe showing interest in something, they kind of have that mindset. It's like, okay, let's
Yeah,
get them in this slot at the school right away, and they need to things need to be regimented right away, and like there needs to be a schedule around it as opposed to like letting them be with
yeah, like you got to
those
get into
things
Juilliard.
and see how where it goes, you know.
Yeah,
And
and
but
you'll find your way. You'll feel what you want to do, and then you'll have that love for it because you know what it took to get there, and you weren't forced because
absolutely.
you can always change your mind.
Um, and so one thing I never really asked you about too, like, do you remember like your earliest recollection of like when you like kind of got into movies or Hitchcock or horror movies, like when you were a kid, how
Okay.
you might have came across that or
How I came, I think I was doing my self help at that point.
self help?
I never slept. I
Huh?
used to sit out on the porch in Carnival, and I was just sit there in the dark. Because when I would go to sleep, I would see things.
How old
And
were
if
you?
I thought of a bad thought, I would actually feel a punch. I was my worst nightmare.
Wow.
So I think I started to watch these off the wall things just to lighten up, to get my own head
Do you
straight.
remember how old you were at that time?
Uh, Probably like I remember it's like seventh grade is when it really hit.
Wow. Okay.
But I had horrible teachers in seventh grade too, so
Right.
that was
You remember
also
you
a help. I
we had
used to,
I remember you telling me stories about how tough
yeah.
it was in school. But so like to in order to kind of alleviate that or deal with it,
I
that's when
th-
you kind of think you kind of got into
I think so. I
movies.
think I was because my I like you don't sleep. You kind of get screwed up. So I think I kind of tended towards these off the wall kind of horror movies and could relate that it's fake
Hmm.
because I was by myself in my room, and a lot of things could happen in your brain that you don't understand. So I would stay up, and I think watching these kind of movies helped me realize that this is fake. And then I used to do it with Uncle Danny when I used to babysit him. I made him watch The Tingler.
Hmm.
Did you ever see that movie? It's the
Yes.
spine
Yes.
that comes to
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
in the movie theater.
It's funny you bring up Uncle Danny because I remember I don't know why I've always remembered this thing and it's totally related to movies, but I remember and it's funny because it's a movie that I keep hearing about, and I remember seeing it at Uncle Danny's, and eventually want to buy it on Blu-ray. And it's this movie that came out. It was like late '70s, early '80s. My favorite. I mean, I love all kinds of movies and genres, but my favorite two styles. My favorite style is horror and science fiction, but I particularly like my favorite style is like more the low budget grindhouse movies. A lot of the things that I cover, movies like we talked about, the Tourist Trap, and like those are my favorite movies. But there's a movie that came out in the late '70s, maybe early '80s, called Doctor Butcher, and I don't know if you remember this, but I remember I slept over Uncle Danny's house. One I think it was like one night. Slept over his house, and I remember Uncle Danny was into. He liked movies. He liked horror movies. I remember you guys had similar tastes because you used to take him to
Yeah,
drive-in movies, and you used to go to see a lot of the old school kung fu,
yeah. When I
martial
babysit,
arts movies.
yeah.
And so you guys had like similar tastes and that kind of thing. But I remember he was into that stuff, and I remember staying over his house, and he had rented movies. Maybe it was, I think, yeah, it might have been that he had rented some movies. And one of the movies he watched, that we ended up watching, was Doctor Butcher, and I remember it terrified me to where I think I I was like trying, I couldn't sleep, and I was trying to come home. I got so
I
scared that
remember.
I didn't want to stay there, and I wanted to come. And I think you eventually picked me up or something because I couldn't
Oh,
stay there. But that movie bothered me, and it was the first movie. And again, it's something I want to see again because of well nostalgic reasons. But that's like it's been on my list again to see again anyway. But that was one of the first like kind of
Scary,
grindhouse
scary.
movies, but it's like really sleazy and but very gory, like super gory, and it was like from the late '70s. But it had a thing of like, kind of it had a vibe to it, like like we were talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it feels like a
Too
documentary.
real.
It feels real, and I remember Dr. Butcher kind of had that too. It was very low budget, but I don't know if you remember that story. But
I
that
don't know. I
I was like, I couldn't sleep there. I was like kind of crying and just like, it
oh
bothered me, and that was like a level, like I never experienced that with a film that scared me that much, and I think because like that was one of the reasons you probably kept me away from watching
too
movies like
realistic
Texas or
movie.
Exorcist, because they seem very real. Like at a certain age, there's a certain time you probably shouldn't see certain things. Like I remember even like you would, and I used to lie about it, but one of the other things I used to do, like we would go to the video store. There were like one or two video stores by our house, and we rent VHS tapes. I used to rent, the horror movies. A lot of the movies that I cover on this channel are those very same movies that I've now bought on Blu-ray, because they get this incredible treatment now, which is amazing. Like Tourist Trap,
That's yeah.
it's crazy. There's like at one point that movie was kind of considered a piece of crap, but I love it. But there's been four different releases, four different editions, four different companies have released it because there's such a demand
It's amazing. It really is
now.
amazing.
And this was
Yeah.
like how many years ago? But so it's just wild that like you have that, kind of demand. But like, like I was saying with movies like The Exorcist and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like they were a little bit, those films were kind of at a different level, and they're a little bit more gritty and a little bit more realistic in a lot of ways.
Mm.
Like I was saying, with the experience with Dr. Butcher, that kind of experience. But I remember one of the things I used to do when I used to sneak, and I think I would kind of lie about it, but when we used to go to the video store, maybe you don't remember this, maybe, but we used to go to the video store, the local video store. I used to like get all the, I was way into the ninjas and ninja movies, and I get, all the horror movies that I could get, but I used to get Faces of Death,
Oh, that one I didn't like at
and I
all.
used to get Faces of Death, and I used to tell you, I knew a little bit about it, but I used to tell you that, well, it's all fake. But the whole thing about Faces of Death was that supposedly the whole series, there's like five or six of them. That whole thing was basically they were made out to be these movies that were snuff films where people were actually, were being killed in them, and
Mm.
where the people were, actual footage
So
of real
yeah.
cannibalism, people actually being eaten by alligators, and people like blowing their own brains out, fun things like that. And that these were like actual videos of these things happening. And I remember I used to kind of lie to you about it, be like, no, that's like Friday 13th, and like
Yeah.
you wouldn't let me rent them. And then I think eventually you got wind of what they were, and then you were like, you wouldn't let me
Well,
watch
yeah.
them anymore. But the funny thing is, so fast forward, well, it was, and again, I think like obviously there's certain things at certain ages that kids probably shouldn't see. But ironically, fast forward, many many years. Actually, it was just 2 or 3 years ago. I was in Goodwill in Rockland, where I buy a lot of used movies. They have a really great movie selection, and I buy a lot of movies there too. It's pretty much where I go to get movies. Is like Bull Moose. Like I buy all the newer re-editions, re-releases, and then I go to the Goodwill in Rockland because they just have amazing selections. But 2 or 3 years ago, I was in the Goodwill in Rockland, and I saw that they had the full collection of Faces of Death,
Oh wow.
and I was just like, "That's hilarious!" And like, of all places to find that is there, so I ended up buying it. It was like $3. I bought the whole edition of the whole collection of Faces of Death, which I have, and I watched it, and I'm like, "Wow, like this stuff is still pretty rough and nasty." But then I was I came across this documentary, and it was an interview with the filmmakers who made those movies, and the whole thing was this revelation. They talked about how about 90% of those films, everything was staged. It was all completely staged, and the company who had backed them, I think they were this Japanese company. These guys had made documentaries before, and they basically went around to like crime scenes and would film these crime scenes, but then these guys who back then, this company, they wanted them to kind of edit the videos and put in a lot of actors and create these scenes around this footage. So it ended up coming out that about 90% of the footage in these films was actually fake. Whereas it was sold, I remember when I was a kid, which created the demand for it. I mean, it's pretty sick stuff, but created demand for it that it was all real, but it really wasn't. So it was a funny thing seeing those again after all those years and then realizing, well, no, that stuff was actually fake. A lot of it. There's still some real things in it, but, and then how I used to, lie to you basically and say,
Yeah.
oh, it's, but
Well, now you know.
now I know. And, but that was, I always talk about the time of VHS, and that was, we used to
Oh yeah.
go and I don't know, every Friday night or whatever, we would go out and rent a pile of
Movies.
movies, and then I remember we would go to the movies. We used to go to the movies all the time. We would go out to, to Friendlies afterwards, and I remember you took me to see a few of the Friday 13th movies in the theater, and and I just did a show on that, and so it's funny how all these things are still part of my life.
Yeah, they still continuing. That I don't think they'll ever die. Halloween is still going on.
Yeah, well, it's
So
bigger than
nothing-
ever. Yeah.
And they're not timed, so they're not going to ever lose. Their thing with the audience because they're not set in a certain time where you're going to get bored with it.
Absolutely.
It's gonna have a long life. It's probably like a considered a classic series.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, the last three, like I said too, David Allen Green, who just made the last three movies, they've made billions of dollars just those three alone, and so it's never, horror's bigger now than ever. So it's it's something else, and then get back to a lot of these movies that I cover, to think that there's enough of an audience now where these, that they're now there's an audience like a lot of people responsible for these films are like getting paid now how many years later when they didn't really make any money.
It's good horror. It's good stories. Like The Hills Have Eyes. That was a good one.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then they started to make more, and then they take away from it. The first one was really good.
Yeah.
Then they get stupid like Jaws. Jaws was good in the 1 and 2, but then after that, it became dumb.
Yeah, they got really terrible. I think we saw those in the theater too.
Yeah, they just the 1 and 2 were good, and they should have left it at that.
The one with was it the third one with was Michael Caine in it, and the shark was actually following the
The Bahamas or
following
something.
him. Yeah, to the Bahamas.
Following Jet.
Because the son, it was just Roy Scheider was not in it. He was dead.
Yeah.
And then so it was just the
The
mother
son,
and
yeah.
then the son.
Yeah, that was really dumb. They
Yeah,
should have
pretty
left
bad.
it alone.
So I know we're like closing up here in an hour, and
Oh, we are. Wow. Time
is there?
flies.
I don't know if there's any. Thanks again for doing this. This is a total blast. I think this will be
Well, I got to show the
a pretty
people.
insightful kind of thing as to how my
This
crazy
is-
brain, why it is the way it is,
The
or how
first
it works.
toy that I bought you when you were a baby. You were 2 years old. It's March 1977 on the foot
77.
for Christmas. You can't see this all the time. Hi, Jason.
I'm curious, like if what this would be worth if it was still in a box.
I've seen it on antique shows.
It's
Not in a box. I don't have the box, but it's almost 50 years old. So 3 more years of being antique.
crazy.
Yeah, huh?
Yeah, that's another thing which I haven't gotten to, which I'm amazed to. But that's another thing. My deep love for Godzilla and all the Toho, the famous Japanese studio that put out all the great Japanese.
And Mothra. Remember
Mothra, and those were things I, again, always on TV, and have a deep, deep love for Godzilla, and I haven't done any shows on Godzilla, which I need to get on that. So,
Yeah,
but
Godzilla's
that
nice.
was yeah, that was an amazing
your
time.
Present when it's 2 years old.
Yeah, but since we're kind of finished, closing up an hour, and to keep you too much longer. But is there anything else you wanted to talk about, or? close things off with?
Not really.
Okay.
I said, I'm proud of you. You're a good son. You got nice friends. Keep it up.
Um, so thanks, my mom, who, I figured when I had this whole idea last week, and friends Daniel, Jim, Jillian brought it up, and we were kind of like looking at it as a joke, and like that, like, too silly. But then I was like, a day or two later, a day went by, and I was like actually thinking about it. I'm like, no, it makes sense because, you know, she brought me into this crazy world, and it's just like, why my brain is as warped as it is, and why I love the things that I love and that I'm passionate about with, the stuff I do with quantum and the movie stuff, and how it's all kind of, it's all interconnected. So I figured, why not have,
All right.
Heart of the Source on here. So thanks again for doing this. And
Okay.
this is my mom again, Susan Dean, the famous resident in Northport, Maine. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Oh, hi, Daniel. Hi, Jillian.
Peace.